Howdy, my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with another ranking video, and today's is going to be a fun one. It's a little different from the usual. Today we're going to be looking at every game put out by Valve in the 2000s. Now here on the channel we ranked all the Half-Life games, we ranked Counter-Strike, and now I think it's time to look at one of the eras of Valve. Now Valve Corporation in the 2000s was easily their strongest run ever, at least from a game's perspective. Now Valve doesn't really need an introduction here, do they? Half-Life, Counter-Strike, Team Fortress 2, Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, Portal. These are some of the most beloved games of all time, all put out by Valve Corporation. And then of course Steam, the Valve Index, the Steam Deck. It's pretty fair to say that Valve is one of the most important companies in video game history, and probably the most important company in PC gaming history. And so today I thought we would celebrate them a little. We're going to rank every single game put out by Valve from the year 2000 to 2009. While they didn't develop all of these games, they did at the very least publish all of them. And in the cases where they didn't develop them, I'll make it pretty clear who did. And just to clarify, all they had to do was publish the game to get onto this list. Now, Valve put out a lot of stellar games in the 2000s, way more than any of the other eras of Valve. And a lot of these games are some of the most beloved games in gaming history, especially PC gaming history. And so we're going to try to rank them from worst to best. We're going to be looking at everything. How have they aged? How do they hold up? How are they in current day? What kind of personal memories and nostalgia do I have for these games? I played a lot of these games when they were pretty much new. Are they still fun to come back to? We're pretty much just looking at everything here. And like I just said, a lot of these games are incredibly beloved. A lot of people have some amazing, fond memories with these games, myself included. And so when it comes to ranking all these games from worst to best, I think everybody's going to have a different opinion here. There are just so many fantastic games here that it's pretty much impossible for everybody to have the same list. And nowadays, unfortunately, Valve doesn't really make any games, but in the 2000s, they really went on one of the greatest runs like that the industry has ever seen. It was release after release after release, and it was banger after banger after banger. Like, it was fantastic game after fantastic game. It really was kind of a golden era, especially for PC gaming. Now, something that Valve games are synonymous with is mods. There are tons upon tons of mods, especially for a lot of these games, and I'm not going to be including any mods on this list. Every game on this list has been commercially, officially released. I'd love to talk about all the amazing mods for the Source engine, but today's not the day for that. With that in mind, making this list was like stupidly hard to make. I went back and redid it a number of times, and this is really just kind of what I'm feeling today. It could totally change tomorrow, but as of this moment, this is my list. This is what I feel. We're only going to be including new games here, as a number of Valve's games were re-released in the 2000s and only one version of each game. So let me know down below your favorite Valve games, maybe what your list would look like, share, comment, sub, all that good stuff. Let's just get right into it. What is the worst game that Valve put out in the 2000s? So in last place I have a couple games. I have what I like to call life support multiplayer games. So in the 2000s, Valve put out a number of multiplayer only games. Now, a couple of these games aren't exactly thriving in 2022, and so I thought I would put them all together. Now, I'm not going to say that all of these games are like totally dead and that there's no one playing. No, like I said, they're on life support. They're really near the end of their life cycle, and only the most hardcore fans are still playing these. And that is if you can even find a match in 2022 for any of these games. So I have 3 games for this entry. I have Ricochet, which was this weird multiplayer jumping game with a Tron-like aesthetic. Unfortunately, this game was dead even by the time I got to it in the late 2000s. We have Deathmatch Classic, which was originally a Half-Life mod, and this is a recreation of the Deathmatch mode from id Software's shooter Quake in the Gold Source game engine. This I actually did play some games of in the early 2010s, I believe, and I remember thinking that it wasn't really anything special and I'd rather just play Quake. And lastly, we have Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, which was the standalone multiplayer component for Half-Life 2. Now this, you can actually probably still find some multiplayer matches of Half-Life 2 Deathmatch. I don't know if they're playing Deathmatch or it's just some crazy modded server, but you can actually find people still playing Half-Life 2 Deathmatch. I really was never able to play Deathmatch as a deathmatch game. I could only ever find the modded servers, even back in like the 2010s. Either way, it's fair to say all 3 of these games aren't exactly popping off and they don't have a ton of players going to play them in 2022. You can still probably find games at some point for these games, but yeah, they're at the bottom of the list because they're pretty much near the end of their life cycle, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're just totally dead by the end of who knows when. People are never going to leave Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, but yeah, that's it for the worst. Alright, and so here we have Counter-Strike Condition Zero developed by Ritual Entertainment, Turtle Rock Studios, and some help from Valve, put out by Valve in 2004. It was actually the follow-up to 1.6, still running on the Gold Source engine though, updating a lot of the graphics, including the character models, the textures, and modifying some of the maps. It even had 2 single-player campaigns, Tour of Duty and Deleted Scenes. We're just kind of putting everything together here for Condition Zero. Personally, I don't have a ton of experience with this game, especially online. I've played like a handful of games and just went, well, why wouldn't I just play 1.6? It seems better than this. This game is, slightly better graphics. It's got some reworked map areas and, again, some better graphics. The game still does go online and people are still actually playing it, so that puts it above Counter-Strike Xbox by default, but I just don't really see any reason why I'd want to play this over 1.6 in terms of the online. So that leads us with Tour of Duty and the Deleted Scenes. Tour of Duty really is just a bunch of bot matches. You go through all the maps, defeating bots, completing challenges, and this really doesn't have a lot to it. I mean, it's actually pretty challenging, and a number of the challenges can actually be pretty tricky, but you really just go through all the maps in bot matches. There's really not a lot to this, and so that leaves us with the Deleted Scenes. Now, the Deleted Scenes, I've heard some pretty terrible things about over the years, and after playing this game for even a short amount of time, you can really see why you've heard so many terrible things. The Deleted Scenes are pretty bad. You quickly realize in a single-player setting just how generic Counter-Strike is, and I don't think it makes for a very exciting single-player experience. There's not really much of a story here. There's 12 missions to go through, and they're all equally bland and just kind of boring. It kind of reminds me of like those old Delta Force games, or I guess a precursor to Modern Warfare really, but none of these missions stand out all that much. There are a few set pieces here where you have to blow up a car or something, but they really just don't do anything all that exciting. Now, my biggest issue with this game has got to be the actual gunplay and just general gameplay when you're running around shooting people. It is bad for a number of reasons. The guns don't behave at all like how Counter-Strike guns behave. They all just kind of feel very similar and don't have any unique attributes like CS has them. And I guess I can kind of understand them tweaking it for a single player campaign, but I still just don't think they feel all that well. They don't really have much impact. The enemies don't really react to them, and then the enemies themselves, the AI is just awful in this game. Like, they don't do like anything. They don't put up any challenge. You'll headshot them and they won't die, which doesn't really make much sense. And ultimately, it's just incredibly unsatisfying killing these guys. There's just nothing really to it, and it doesn't have any of the weight or impact that regular CS has. The game is also just incredibly buggy, whether it's the AI glitching out your teammates or not not being able to go through doors, or the set pieces not working, or just having to restart areas. I was like, why is this game so buggy all these years later? At least the game has a bunch of different environments, so that's good, but Condition Zero as a whole is absolutely not worth playing. This game came out in 2004. Let me tell you what else came out in 2004. Doom 3, Far Cry, Half-Life 2, Counter-Strike Source. This game gets blown away by all of those. It wasn't good when it came out, and I wouldn't say it's worth playing now. The graphical upgrades just aren't worth it. Go back to 1.6. Yeah, not worth playing. So here is Half-Life Blue Shift, a standalone expansion to the original Half-Life released in 2001, developed by Gearbox, yes, Borderlands Gearbox, and originally published by Sierra. Later re-releases would all be by Valve. Blue Shift stars Barney Callahan, a character that briefly, and I mean briefly, shows up in the original game for like a split second. He's a security guard that lets Gordon in. Well, this whole expansion is about him. It takes place during Half-Life 1 when all the shit goes down, and you're just trying to get the hell out of Black Mesa. There's really not much to go off of here. The story is about as basic as it gets. Barney isn't really further developed either, and it doesn't expand the Half-Life world in any meaningful way. So lacking story aside, the gameplay is very similar to Half-Life 1 and Opposing Force. However, it's a much lesser version of those games for a number of reasons. You still move through Black Mesa, a seamless world, and you fight these creatures, these aliens, and obviously the armed forces, and you solve some occasional puzzles and do some platforming, and that's really it. I know that doesn't sound terribly different from the original Half-Life, but this game really misses the mark in just about everything. When it comes to the pacing, the level design, the encounters, the puzzles, the platforming, it just is nowhere near as good as the original game or Opposing Forces. For starters, the level design is just not that great. It feels very segmented. It doesn't feel as fluid as the original games. The puzzles are just not very well designed. I mean, they're all super basic, and most of the time they just involve you pushing stuff. The platforming, which was never very good in Half-Life to begin with, is really exposed here. And all of the combat encounters feel like lesser versions of combat encounters from other games. There's no new enemies, there's no new weapons, there's no new ideas. It brings really nothing new to the Half-Life table like at all. The game is also like 2, maybe 3 hours long on a first playthrough, so it ends before it even gets started. And the ending is nothing special at all. There's no final boss, there's no big encounter. I don't even think there's like any music in this game either, or if there is, there's very little. There's just really not much going on with this game. This is probably, no. This is the only Half-Life game I do not recommend. It is not worth playing. You'll probably have it if you buy all the Half-Life games on Steam, but it's just not worth playing. There's really nothing here. And so here we have the original Day of Defeat, which was a World War II multiplayer mod for Half-Life, but it was commercially released in 2003 by Valve. So Day of Defeat takes place, like I said, in World War II. It is exclusively multiplayer. The game really does have a heavy emphasis on teamwork and features objective-based game modes in combination with its system of classes. Maps are usually these like kind of narrow pathways. There's actually a lot of maps in this game, which usually lead to a number of key locations. Really what it comes down to is some very frantic capture the point gameplay that actually can get pretty crazy if there's a lot of people playing. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of people playing the original Day of Defeat anymore for one very specific reason I'll get to in a bit. But I wouldn't say that the game is on life support, at least not yet, but I wouldn't say it's thriving either. It's very close to that life support. I have actually played quite a bit of the original Day of Defeat. I do think it is a bit slower than its remake, but I still had a decent enough time with it. The game can actually have some really fun team-based gameplay. Look, it's not Team Fortress and it's not Counter-Strike, but I think that this is still a good time also. I wish it wasn't on almost life support, as yeah, this game is actually decently fun still. I mean, at the very least, the people still playing this game, like, who seriously still play this game, are actually pretty crazy, which is pretty funny. I got you now. Now, while I wouldn't say go out and play Day of Defeat or really recommend it, I could say for the time it was a fun, decent little multiplayer World War II shooter that was a good time, and it's really seen its better days, but it was still fun. And so here we have Half-Life 2 Episode 1 initially releasing in 2006, developed and put out by Valve. Now, Episode 1 had the unenviable task of following up Half-Life 2. Valve thought it would be better to release a few episodes based on Half-Life 2 rather than waiting a long time for Half-Life 3. Well, we all know what ended up happening in the end. Now, while I think Episode 1 is still good, it is the weakest of the Half-Life 2 games, but it does have its own merits. It takes place right after Half-Life 2 and sees Alex getting Gordon out of some rubble, and basically for spoiler reasons, they have to get the hell out of City 17. Most of the game takes place in either the Citadel or City 17. Now, while the original Half-Life 2 had you team up with Alex a few times, Episode 1 has you team up with Alex the entire time. Alex never leaves your side, really. She's with you the whole game. This game is all about building Alex up, building the relationship between Alex and Gordon up, and just, it's all about the story mostly. And you know, I gotta say, it's actually pretty cool to have Alex with you the whole time. She has pretty good AI, she is a good character, I like the dynamic between Gordon and Alex, and I think the story is probably the strongest part of the entire game. But when it comes to the gameplay, really nothing has changed from Half-Life 2. It plays almost identical to Half-Life 2. There are some minor tweaks here and there, but yeah, it really is basically the same as Half-Life 2. The game has you go through a tightly crafted world, solving puzzles using the gravity gun to get through areas, and of course fighting zombies and the Combine. This game introduces a new enemy, the Zombine, but there's only one new enemy. There's no new weapons here, and half the game you actually don't even have weapons, you just have the gravity gun. But if you enjoyed Half-Life 2, I think for the most part you will enjoy Episode 1, as it does play very similarly. The level design is still pretty good, but I do think the game is lacking in a few areas. My two biggest issues with the game are the pacing and the length of the game. The game starts out very slow. It's really like a crawl, especially by Half-Life standards, as you go through the Citadel pretty slowly with just the gravity gun, and they're really building up the relationship between Alex and Gordon and just kind of dealing with the repercussions of the previous game. And it just isn't the most exciting. Now, in a full-length game, this really wouldn't be an issue at all, as it's just kind of establishing everything, but Episode 1 is like 2.5, maybe 3 hours long, so like half the game is just this really slow start. But once it finally gets going, it really does get going, and it does improve, and it gets better, and it becomes the Half-Life 2 gameplay that you really fell in love with. The other thing I don't like is I don't like the ending sequence of the game where you have to get these people on the train. You just have to move them back and forth. I've never liked this sequence, no matter how many times I've done it. I've just never been a big fan of going back and forth. I think it gets kind of old quickly, and the AI isn't the smartest when it comes to this area. It's not terrible by any means, and it's a fine enough escort mission, I guess, but I've just never really liked it. And again, this wouldn't really be a big issue in a full-length game, maybe just a little point I don't like, but because the game is so short, this becomes a good chunk of the game. This is probably 20% of the game, and I don't really like it. This game really feels like it's kind of setting up episode 2, and with that in mind, it just isn't as great as the other games on this list. I still do recommend it. It is worth playing, and the story is actually pretty good. It's just, when you compare all the other Half-Life games, yeah, it's kind of near the bottom. And so here we have Day of Defeat Source, initially releasing in 2005. Now, Day of Defeat Source is really what Counter-Strike Source is to the original Counter-Strike. It's a remake of the original game, moving it from Gold Source to the Source engine. Unlike Counter-Strike Source, though, I think this game is a bit better than its original game, and it's certainly more popular. This game existing really is why the original Day of Defeat doesn't have very many people left. Now, Day of Defeat Source really does take that original fun team-based gameplay from the original game and brings it over to the Source engine. There are some differences between this and the original. For instance, it does feel a bit more arcade and it is quite a bit faster, but it's not just the graphics that were upgraded here. I think the graphics are pretty decent for the time, and I think the gameplay is still fun. There's a bunch of classes to choose from, and yeah, if you like the original Day of Defeat, you'll like this game. I think this game is quite a bit better than the original. I think the shooting and handling of the weapons is just a lot better. I like some of the new game modes and some of the new maps that were introduced in DODs. I really like that this game does actually retain all the great aspects of the original game and just improves it. Like, all the classes are still here. I think they're all still pretty unique, and you gotta actually be a team player. You can't just run off and be Rambo. You're not really gonna get anywhere in this game. You need some actual teamwork if you want to win some matches. And I've had some really fun memories with this game, especially in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I would actually play this game quite a bit with my friends, as we just had a blast. However, unfortunately, like the original Day of Defeat, this game isn't exactly the most thriving, and it has seen its better days. There's always a couple hundred people online, so it's doing a lot better than the original Day of Defeat, but yeah, it isn't a poppin' multiplayer game anymore. Still, it was pretty fun, and I think that it is worth trying. Especially if you like World War II shooters, then you should totally just check it out. It's usually pretty cheap. It is a bit retro now, but it is pretty cheap. And so here we have Counter-Strike Source, initially releasing in 2004. Counter-Strike Source was originally released with Half-Life 2, but eventually would get its own standalone release. I'm pretty sure most people play it nowadays. Now, Counter-Strike Source I know hasn't gotten the most love throughout the years, but I still have a ton of fun memories with this game, especially its modding scene. I've had a ton of fun on modded maps, and really everything but competitive Counter-Strike. See, Counter-Strike Source was never really seen as like the competitive Counter-Strike. It did have a competitive scene, especially back in the day, but nowadays I'm pretty sure it's pretty dwindling in the competitive scene. I'm not saying it didn't ever have a competitive scene, it's just nowhere near as big as 1.6 or Go. And you know, there was a variety of reasons why Counter-Strike Source never took off like 1.6 or Go. It had a very botched release. People thought that the game was just easier to play than the original, and the truth is 1.6 was still doing people just fine by the time Source came out, and people just didn't really want to move to Source. Despite never really taking off all that much competitively, I still have had a ton of fun with this game. Something that this game has over 1.6 and Go is it had a great, still has a really good modding scene. If you want to play some crazy ass game modes, Counter-Strike Source is definitely the game. It had a really fun gun game, it had a really fun zombies mod. Like, I really love the modded servers of Counter-Strike Source. And it was definitely the biggest highlight for me personally with Source. The core gameplay was still pretty solid. I mean, it's Counter-Strike, it's always going to be decently solid. Really, the game was just kind of a remake of 1.6 in Source's engine, so you know, better physics, better graphics. But despite that, the core gameplay is still absolutely Counter-Strike. It's still pretty much the same premise, it's like the same maps too. It just, again, it didn't take off for the reasons I mentioned, and I think Source has a great community. I think a lot of the modded servers are really fun. I've had a ton of memories. You needed to play Trouble in Terrorist Town on Gary's mod, at least you used to. I don't think you do anymore, but Counter-Strike Source is still a really fun time. It's pretty goofy nowadays and isn't taken seriously really all that much anymore, but I mean, if you're going to try Counter-Strike, there's no reason to not try Source. You'll probably get it in the bundle anyway. And the game is actually still relatively active with a couple thousand players a day on Steam at least. Let me know your favorite community servers down below. I mentioned some of mine. I think it's still worth playing nowadays. And so here we have Gary's mod, developed by Gary Newman and Face Punch Studios, and it was published by Valve in 2006. Now, Gary's Mod was originally released as just a mod for the Source engine and released in 2004 before it was expanded into a standalone release and put out by Valve in 2006. Now, when it comes to Gary's Mod, describing or reviewing or ranking it is really difficult because in its base game mode, it's just a physics-based sandbox game with no objectives. You can spawn in stuff, you can just kind of goof around, you can play with the physics, you can fly around in no clip. In the base game, you just kind of do whatever you want. See, Gary's Mod, it's kind of like a catalyst, a tool for other developers to make their own games or modes for Gary's Mod. That's really what it is a tool for other people to make games. And over the last 15, almost 20 years, people have made tons upon tons of game modes, maps, and just content for Gary's Mod. Some of the most popular game modes, at least that I remember, were Trouble in Terrorist Town. I remember that being really popular in the early 2010s. There's Prop Hunt, and Prop Hunt was really fun, and nowadays it's in mainstream games like Call of Duty, and of course Gmod Towers, which has been replaced by Tower Unite. Gary's Mod was also a really good tool for making machinima. I remember in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Gary's Mod was used for most machinima, and I really do miss those videos. Those were always fun, but Gary's Mod really is just kind of hard to even put in this ranking list. Like, it is a tool and it is absolutely what you make of it. You could play Gary's Mod and just mess around in the single player in the sandbox. You could play with some friends, or you could get on a server and have a bunch of crazy fun. I have endless good memories with Gary's Mod, and I could probably sit here and talk about it all day. I didn't really know where to rank it on this list since it is ultimately just a tool and it's up to the person to find the fun, and really it comes down to your individual experience. So I just put it smack dab in the middle of the list. I thought that was the best spot. You already know though that I can wholeheartedly recommend it. You can have so much fun with Gary's Mod. I mean, there's still so many people playing it nowadays for good reason, because there's always new stuff being made for it. Especially if you have friends though, then it just becomes a legendary game that I will never forget. So thank you, Gary, and thank you, modding community, because this game rules. Alright, and so here we have a legendary game. Here we have the original Portal, released in 2007, developed and published by Valve, originally as part of the Orange Box, but now you can get it standalone. Now, I remember when Portal came out, it was just immediately a cultural icon. People flipped their shit for this game. It was all the talk on the playground along with Modern Warfare, and I remember playing it in the early 2010s and also going, yeah, this is hella good. At this point, I don't really know what there is left to say about Portal. It's one of the most critically acclaimed games of the 2000s. It's a puzzle platformer. It sees you play as Shell in first person, who is challenged and taunted by this artificial intelligence named GLaDOS to complete a bunch of puzzles in the Aperture Science Enrichment Center using a portal gun, with the whole promise being that you'll get a cake if you're able to complete all the challenges. You can shoot two portals, you go in one to go out the other. It's a pretty basic and easy to understand concept, but the puzzles in this game are actually pretty great, and they actually make you do a lot of thinking. I think it goes without saying that this is probably one of the very best puzzle games ever made, and a lot of these puzzles don't have one solution. A number of them actually have multiple solutions, which is pretty cool, and you can actually play through the game a few times finding different solutions. The game throws a number of different obstacles at you, like the companion cube, like the turrets, and you gotta figure out how to get through these puzzles. I just don't really think there's ever been another game that's all that similar to it aside from Portal 2. The game had a pretty solid presentation, but then this game was really praised for its writing and just general world. I think it's actually exceptionally well done. GLaDOS is a fantastic character. She's constantly mocking you and talking down to you, but also somewhat congratulating you because she wants you to finish the tests. The writing is just exceptionally well done, and the cake, it still is a lie after all these years. It really is amazing how just such a simple concept like Portal is executed in such ingenious ways that it really just makes you think about all the possibilities that this thing could have, and Valve was able to really capitalize it on the sequel. This game is still pretty good. I still really do enjoy it. The only thing is it's not the longest. You can finish it pretty quick. It's very easily finishable in one sitting. It's a fantastic sitting, that's for sure. The game is absolutely great. It's only like an hour or two long, which is why it's at where it's at in this list. But I can confidently say Portal is one of those games I think everybody, and I truly do mean everybody, should try before they die. It is definitely worth playing. So here's another legendary game. Here we have the original Left 4 Dead, developed by Valve / Total Rock Studios, put out by Valve in 2008. Left 4 Dead, is another one of those just really critically acclaimed titles that people were just absolutely popping off for when it released. I remember a lot of people were popping off in the late 2000s for it, saying Left 4 Dead and its sequel were the best zombie games ever made. And you know, all these years later, the impact that Left 4 Dead made is still absolutely felt, and it really was kind of a landmark title for co-op games, in my opinion. Now, Left 4 Dead is a 4-player cooperative first-person shooter which sees 4 survivors trying to get through a set amount of levels, just trying to really survive. And you know, the story wasn't anything all that complex or crazy. It takes place during a zombie outbreak on the east coast of the US and really just sees 4 people coming together to just try to survive. The 4 survivors were Francis, Bill, Zoe, and Lewis, all very different from each other, all with distinct personalities and a ton of charm. It's pretty safe to say that these characters are all just kind of legendary at this point. A lot of people just really took to the characters of Left 4 Dead, and you know, I can see why. They're all quirky, they're all funny, they got some good lines, and the writing was generally pretty good in this game. But when it comes to actually playing the game, Left 4 Dead, like I said, is a first-person shooter where you take control of one of 4 survivors. You can either have your friends or the AI, and you're just trying to go from point A to B. Sometimes you have some other objectives, but for the most part, it really is just A to B. You'll be constantly attacked by zombies, and this game is a really dynamic feature known as the AI director. See, in most video games, when you play through a level, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be either the same or nearly the same. Like, all the enemies will show up at the same spots, set pieces that were going to happen are going to happen. It's pretty normal. With the AI director, there's a lot more randomness thrown into this, so a lot of the enemy spawn points are all over the map depending on the situation. Sometimes the weapons or items might be different, or they might be in different locations completely. Really, this affects the pacing of a lot of the levels and just can affect the entire gameplay. It isn't totally random, it is dependent on your situation. For instance, if one team member is getting really far away from the rest of the team, the AI director likely will spawn an enemy that will incapacitate that person to slow them down or make it so they gotta work with the team. Another big aspect of Left 4 Dead is the teamwork. You're going to need the other survivors' help for pretty much everything in this game. Like, you can kill zombies, but there are plenty of zombies that will incapacitate you, and there's plenty of actions that you'll need to do in these levels that require more than one person. And the game's focus on teamwork was really refreshing for when it came out because Modern Warfare really was taking over. Now, the actual weapons and shooting of this game is pretty solid. The weapon roster is pretty standard, nothing all that special. They all do feel really nice, and the game does have a sense of realism at the very least. Now, there are a bunch of enemies in this game. There's, of course, regular zombies, which, you know, just kind of run at you and you just kind of blow them away, or you can smack them. But then there's all the special infected. Now, this game has a bunch of special infected, and they all have their own musical cues and little aspects. Now, this game has a number of campaigns to it. It doesn't have a bunch, and you could probably finish them all in about 4 or 5 hours, but something that Left 4 Dead has is, one, it has replayability thanks to the AI director, but it also does have some multiplayer. It actually has a really fun multiplayer mode called Versus that I remember having a lot of fun with back in the day. So Versus is where it's the survivors versus the zombies, but you don't just play as the survivors here, you get to play as the zombies too. It's 4v4, and playing as the zombies is actually a ton of fun also. Trying to just sneak up on the other players and just totally wipe them out and ruin their game, oh, it never gets old. And there is also a survival mode. Left 4 Dead is probably one of the best co-op games like ever made, and it is really one of the best zombie games ever made. It's incredibly fun, it's dynamic, there's a ton of replayability, and it still is a very good time. The only reason it's not higher on this list is because, like some of the other Valve games, it kind of gets obliterated by its sequel, and all of this game's content is in its sequel, so I don't really think there's any reason to play Left 4 Dead 1 at this point. Just play Left 4 Dead 2 where it's got everything from this game in it. Still an absolute great time that is totally worth playing. And so here we have Half-Life 2 Episode 2, originally released as part of the Orange Box in 2007, developed and published by Valve. They really build on Episode 1, they establish the world and the gameplay and all that. Let's get crazy with it. The story obviously continues from Episode 1 and sees them out of City 17 and they're in the wilderness, and most of the game takes place in the woods, and I'll just leave it at that. The story is very good, it is better than Episode 1, it might be the best story of all of the games, seriously, it's really well done, Alex is really great, and the pacing of the game is great. Now, something that Episode 1 really didn't have that Half-Life 2 had was a lot of variety and set pieces, and Episode 2 really rectifies this with a lot of set pieces and a ton of variety. You are never doing the same thing in this game at all. You are always doing something different here, and it's always really interesting what you're doing. I think every set piece is more interesting than all of episode 1. They're all really well thought out, well designed, and actually really fun to play through. Whether you're going through the mines or you're defending the base and driving the car, I really think it is like peak first-person shooter gameplay. It is just absolutely fantastic. The gunplay is great, the levels are great, the pacing is really well done, the puzzles are actually pretty good, the platforming, there's barely any of it. The gameplay is really firing off on all cylinders. I would argue that it might be the very best gameplay that the series has ever seen. It seriously is that good. While it doesn't bring any new weapons to the table, it brings a lot of new enemies and other environmental aspects that you can use to fight these enemies, such as these new bombs to take striders out. I just think that the combat is, again, the best that the series has ever seen. You will not get bored playing episode 2. The length is way better than episode 1 also. It's probably twice as long at like 4, maybe 5 hours if you take your time. My biggest issue with the game is really the ending. The game has a pretty notorious cliffhanger ending that still has really not been concluded all these years later, and yeah, that just kind of bothers me at this point. And really, all these years later, I'm pretty doubtful that we'll ever see a conclusion to this game, which is quite disheartening. But I still think that Episode 2 is absolutely worth playing. It is a great game, and it does have a lot going for it. And so here we have the one that started it all. We have the original Counter-Strike 1.6, initially releasing in 2000 as a mod for Half-Life before eventually getting its own standalone release with Valve. Now, Counter-Strike 1.6... do I really even need to say anything about this game and the landmark title that it is? The legacy that this game has left on not only the gaming scene but esports in general? To say that the game's landmark for multiplayer shooters is an understatement. This is like one of the most influential video games probably ever made, and there's a reason there are so many people, even in 2022, still playing this game. Now, I have a lot of fun memories with the original Counter-Strike. All of the fun memories were definitely more competitive rather than Source's crazy modding community, but I still think that if you want to play some classic Counter-Strike, 1.6 you can easily just pick it up and play it like it was 2000, and it's still just as good then. It's aged remarkably well. And honestly, it's still as fun as ever. The only thing I gotta say is if you want to try to get into 1.6 now, you're gonna get annihilated by most of the people playing it nowadays. The people that are playing it nowadays, like pretty seriously, have been playing it a long time. And there's a good reason they've been playing it a long time, is because it's still actually hella good with that really addicting gameplay loop, realistic-ish weapons, just great handling and satisfying team dynamics. And sure, it's not the prettiest game. I will say it didn't even look amazing for when it came out. It looked pretty good, and it hasn't aged all the best. The models are a bit clunky, and some of the textures are really just kind of hideous. But, I mean, that doesn't really matter like at all. The game is still really fun. The gameplay loop is still really good. It was really good back when it came out. It was revolutionary when it came out, and it's still good now. Sure, there's Go, where it's, you know, much better looking and it's a lot smoother than this game, but like this game still, again, it absolutely holds up. And if you really want to see where Counter-Strike came from, you can pick up and play this game. If you've played Go, you can definitely pick up and play this game. You might hate the graphics, but I still think it is fun. It's still worth playing. It's pretty impressive how the game is still very alive and still taken seriously. And at this point, I don't think it really matters how old the game gets. People are still going to be playing this one. This game is just kind of goated at this point. It doesn't matter if it's 20 years old, 30 years old, or even older. There's always going to be people playing this game competitive. It really just has a legendary status to it that can never be tarnished. It's Counter-Strike 1.6. It means a lot to fans of shooters and multiplayer games in general, and I've done enough talking about this one. You don't need me to even talk about it. You already know how important this game is. Alright, and so here we got the sequel to Left 4 Dead, Left 4 Dead 2, developed and published by Valve in 2009. Left 4 Dead 2 really tries to build on the original Left 4 Dead, and I think they build on it in a number of ways to make it the overall better game. The game's premise is still the same. It's still a zombie apocalypse. It has 4 new survivors: Coach, Nick, Rochelle, and Ellis. I think they're better than the first games, fight me. And just like the first game, a lot of people really do love the characters of Left 4 Dead. I think they're all still really quirky, interesting, funny, and they have a lot of good dialogue. The writing is generally pretty good, and yeah, I really do like the characters of Left 4 Dead 2. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, it really does just build on that original game in just about every single way. It takes all the aspects from the original game. You go through a number of campaigns, really just point A to B, just trying to survive, and you have the AI director going after you. There are tons upon tons of zombies to kill in this game, a bunch of different weapons, there's items to use. And each campaign is incredibly dynamic thanks to that director, and the director does even more dynamic stuff now, and a lot of teamwork is going to be needed. This game has an even heavier emphasis on teamwork, and I think that a lot of the new scenarios that are in this game are not only a lot more memorable, but more engaging than the first games. The first game had plenty of good scenarios, don't get me wrong, but I think this game really does have better scenarios, like where you're filling up the car with gas, or when you're going through the carnival. I think that the locations and just general levels are a lot more memorable than anything the first game had. Not to knock on the first game had plenty of good stuff too. It's just, I think this game's better. When it comes to this game's weapons and items, everything from the first game returns. All the weapons feel great, they're all incredibly satisfying, and the way enemies react to the shots is actually really well done. I think the gunplay and animation, really just the reactions to the guns, is a bit underrated. It's actually really well done. This game has a couple new weapons to it, some new guns, some new explosives, some new items, but the big addition to the weapons is there's melee weapons, which obviously never run out of ammo, and you can just totally wreck shit with this. I really always have liked the melee weapons. And I think all the new weapons and new items that are in here really just add to the game. It creates more dynamic environments, it creates a lot more randomness, and it really just adds to the variety here. But it's not just the survivors with new stuff now. There's new special infected. There's the charger, which just charges at you. There's the spitter, which shoots a bunch of acid. And then there's the jockey that jumps onto survivors' backs and tries to steer them into crap. I think, like the new weapons and items, this makes the game more dynamic, it adds some variety, and it really can change things up. The game is much more replayable than the first game thanks to all these features, and the fact that, again, I think the levels are just better. Fight me. Even the AI director has a few new tricks up its sleeve. It can mess with walls, general level layout, lighting, and even the weather conditions, which is pretty cool stuff, and it makes it for, again, you guessed it, more dynamic situations. So Left 4 Dead 2 has a number of new campaigns to play through, and like the first game, they're not the longest. You'll probably finish them all in around 5, maybe 6 hours, but they're incredibly replayable. All the campaigns from the first game show up in the second game as well. And you can even have it where all the new stuff that's in Left 4 Dead 2 is added to the old maps of Left 4 Dead 1, making those more replayable, more dynamic, all that good stuff. Versus Returns, it's better than the first games thanks to all the new stuff. Survival is survival. And then we have Scavenge, a new mode where it's 4v4 again, kind of like, Versus, but instead the survivors are trying to use as many fuel cans scattered around the level to fill up a power generator. Overall, Left 4 Dead 2 really is not just one of the best zombie games, but one of the best cooperative games ever made. It builds on top of the first game, it's much better than the first game. All the first game is in this game with even more. The game has just tons of content and really has endless content with its mods, and they still are low-key updating the game even nowadays. But there's a reason Left 4 Dead 2 is such a legendary title. Like, it's just fantastic, and I have so many fun memories with this game, like endless fun memories with this game, and yeah, it's a no-brainer. And here we have it. We have Team Fortress 2, developed and released by Valve initially in 2007 as part of the Orange Box, eventually releasing as a free-to-play game in 2011. Team Fortress 2 is one of the most legendary, iconic multiplayer games probably ever released. To say that Team Fortress 2 is one of the most successful online games of all time would really be an understatement, because it truly just is. It was huge the moment it came out in 07. People loved it then, thought it was really great, a huge refinement on the original Team Fortress, and here we are many, many years later. We're talking 15 years later, and there's still regularly over 100,000 people playing Team Fortress 2 every single day. And the game still is getting updated all these years later. The game is completely different from that original release. They've added legit hundreds, if not thousands, of skins, weapons, hats, cosmetics, just all this stuff to the game that makes it all the more worth playing. People just love Team Fortress 2 for its great art direction, its legendary, iconic characters, its good sense of humor, its fun gameplay, its great team-based aspects, and really just being a great time no matter if you're casual, if you're competitive. The game supports both. And then, of course, all the mod support. This game has tons of community servers that have a bunch of crazy things going on. Some of the popular ones, like Prop Hunt from Gary's Mod, have made it over here to be some of the most popular game modes here. Like, this game just has really endless content. The core main gameplay of the game is more than solid enough, though. It's blue versus red, and you compete in usually team-based objectives like pushing a cart, capturing a point, and even more. A bunch of stuff has been added since then. There are 9 unique classes, each having their own attributes and skills and being used in certain ways. All of them are incredibly distinct and varied from each other. No two classes even feel close to each other. And the amount of depth every class has, especially at this point in time, is just insane. Each class usually has more depth to it than like most shooters have in the entire game. Like seriously, it gets that like deep. And you can really see how deep the rabbit hole goes with these classes thanks to all the crazy game modes. There's more than what I just mentioned. There's like a King of the Hill, there's a manpower mode, medieval mode, payload race, special delivery, man versus machine, which was really fun, and then some special seasonal events too. Like there is just a ton of events and character and just again depth. And I wouldn't be surprised if, thanks to the community, there's over probably 100,000 different maps for this game. I am not exaggerating. There are legit thousands upon thousands of community maps, and it's pretty crazy. And I really think that one of the best aspects of Team Fortress 2 has always been the community. I don't usually bring community too much into these ranking videos, but it's so integral to Team Fortress 2 that you really can't talk about the game without bringing up its amazing community. There really is no game, no shooter that's had the same kind of community that Team Fortress 2 has had, and that's one of the reasons the game is still so alive nowadays, and I just have a feeling that it will never even get close to dying or life support. Like seriously, people are going to be playing this game forever. It's been 15 years and it's still crazy popular. It's not going anywhere. The game certainly outlived Overwatch by quite some time, which is pretty funny. And when it comes to my memories and just fun with Team Fortress, really like the other games on this list, it just kind of is endless good times, endless memories, like so much fun I've had with this game over the years, whether it was in the early 2010s when it initially went free to play, or even later in its life. I've just always had a great time with Team Fortress, and I was pretty hooked on this game for a while with my friends. We really played Team Fortress like every day, along with Gary's Mod and Left 4 Dead, and it was really just a good Valve time. In my opinion, Team Fortress 2 is the greatest multiplayer game Valve ever made. It's one of the very best games Valve ever made. Why isn't it the top, you ask? Well, I really don't like the influx of bots as of recent. The last couple years have really had some bad bot problems, and the game's economy and market, while it was started simple enough and it was innocent enough, has really transformed into something else, and I think it doesn't really help the game out all that much anymore. It's not as bad as, say, Counter-Strike Goes, which I really hate with all the skins and all that crap and how expensive all of that gets, but this game's economy and market, yeah, it just kind of is a bit annoying. I get that it's here because it's free to play, but I've never been a huge fan of it. But the core gameplay and just how much fun you can have with this game really just does set it apart from everything. I mean, this is a free-to-play game that you can get legit hundreds upon hundreds of hours, different experiences, and it's all free. I would argue Team Fortress 2 is the greatest free-to-play game ever made. Like, seriously, you tell me a free-to-play game that's better than this, and I'm listening. Now, at this point, if you haven't tried Team Fortress 2 at some point in your life, I really don't know what you're waiting on. Better late than never. The game is still crazy active, and it's absolutely worth playing, and it's free. Like, just play it. But you already know when it comes to Valve games in the 2000s, Half-Life 2 is going to be at the top of that list. Initially releasing in 2004, developed and published by Valve, Half-Life 2 is one of the greatest shooters of all time, one of the greatest games of all time. Half-Life 2 is incredible. This game has been praised to hell for the last 20 years at this point, and for very good reason. It's Half-Life 2. It is just a superb game. The game takes place many, many years after Half-Life 1, and Gordon is sent back to Earth after the events of Half-Life 1. It turns out Earth has been completely taken over by a new alien force known as the Combine, and they're pretty much killing off the human race, and it's up to Gordon to just do anything at this point. The story, the world, the characters, the way everything goes in Half-Life 2, I have nothing but the highest praise for. It is just phenomenal. It is crazy interesting. The world building is just so good, and the details that they provide and that you can find around the areas, like, it's just so good. I dare you to find that many first-person shooters that have this level of world building in them. You aren't going to find many because it's just that good. Like the first game, it stays in first person and all of the world is connected. It's not levels, it's not segmented. There's a bunch of set pieces here and there's way more variety here than the first game, but it's all together and it's all incredibly seamless, and the pacing is just so good. You get out on that train and you just kind of take in the world. It's all a bit slow. Things quickly ramp up though, especially with the Combine. you have to escape, and things just keep going and going and ramping up more and more, and it's just incredibly different. This game is so varied. Like, every area is very different from the last, and it just always stays interesting, and it's all good. I wouldn't say there's a single part of this game that is bad, hasn't aged well, or anything even like that. It's all just fantastic. It is tightly crafted, paced, and it's just incredibly engaging. I remember the first time I ever played Half-Life 2 and really got into it. I was in like middle school and I just couldn't put it down. I didn't play anything else for a couple days. I was so engrossed by the world and the areas and the combat and the physics. Oh yeah, the physics. So the physics were kind of in Half-Life 1, but the physics play a major part in Half-Life 2. It really is one of the best games to show off physics, especially thanks to the gravity gun. Physics are a huge part of Half-Life 2, whether you're throwing stuff around, using it to platform, or you're using this amazingly cool gun known as the gravity gun, where you pick shit up and you throw it around and use it as a weapon. It's great stuff. While it could appear a little gimmicky, I assure you it really isn't. It is a core fundamental part of Half-Life 2's design, and it really adds to it. It doesn't take anything away, and it really just makes it even more engrossing, and it actually adds to the puzzles a lot more as well. There's a lot of physics puzzles here. The puzzles are just all around better design than Half-Life 1's. They're not as repetitive or obvious, and it keeps the level design from feeling even close to stale. It keeps everything very interesting, and it plays a big part in the combat as well, as you can use the gravity gun to throw shit around, and that's really fun. It's always been fun. And then there's the weapons. There's a bunch of returning weapons, there's some new weapons, there's a bunch of new enemies, especially the Combine. They play a big part here, and their AI is so much better than any of the AI in the old Half-Life. Like, it is really great when it comes to enemy AI, team AI. It's actually just really well done. I think the combat is real swell. It's probably better in episode 2 than this game, but this game just has everything else going for it that makes it the better game overall. Now, when it comes to playing Half-Life 2, absolutely, everybody should play Half-Life 2. It's a fantastic, just amazing, mind-blowing game, really. There's a couple different versions to play of it now, but the best really is still on the PC, on Steam. It's super cheap. It's been updated graphically, so it looks even better than it did back then. You even get Half-Life Lost Coast, a deleted scene, ooh, and Half-Life Deathmatch, ooh, like nobody's playing it, who cares, but whatever, you get it for free, basically. But over the years, Half-Life 2 has really become one of my favorite games just ever. I think almost everybody can agree that it's just phenomenal. It is one of the very best games probably ever made. Pretty obvious that I recommend Half-Life 2, but I really recommend almost every single game on this list. We're coming towards the end of this video. I've really talked about a lot of amazing games put out by Valve in the 2000s. They really are a legendary game company, and they've really made almost no bad game. A lot of these games are just fantastic. I'm sure my order and placement of these games have ruffled some feathers, but I'd love to know down below your list, your favorite Valve games, all that good stuff. Hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to this part of the video, comment cement. I really do appreciate it. Share with anyone you know, and yeah, have a good one. Stay safe. Bye-bye.